I mean, I think there is something. I mean, I know Martine very well. Very lucky to have met her about a year and a half ago. Soon after they were in exile here in Wales, and I think that sense of safety here is something. I mean, you mentioned it, but it's hugely important. I mean, it's massive. It's far safer than London. It's far safer than a lot of other places in British Isles, and you know, that is an enormous quality to this place. And the question is, are we all taking? I mean, is enough advantage being taken of that safety, and why fragility within safety? What's that about? I think it's a very, very interesting question. David?
I suppose that a word I heard mentioned once or twice, but perhaps slightly less than I thought it might be, was democracy. And I want to put that alongside the theme which I thought came through, and has been mentioned already really, of the impact on children and young people, of the way they experience freedom of artistic expression, creativity in the early years, and the barriers which can be there, and shamingly are still very strongly there, it seems, in our curriculum in Wales too. Because those are the shaping years, and it's so much harder to recover what's lost in childhood when it comes to a sense of how one can express oneself and what is encouraged and what's not encouraged. And if I sort of fast forward 20 or 30 years, by which time, instead of being old, I'll be very, very old if I'm alive at all, and these spring chickens will still be in early middle age, what kind of society will I be living in then? And what responsibility will I have for the actions that we take today for the society in which I live, by not having done what we should have done now in order to change that future? And I'm haunted, in a sense, by the futures, the potential futures that we have. And Di's mentioned neoliberalism, and it's, in my view, corrosive, draining, sucking of communities, really, in Wales as well as elsewhere. The ways in which, so often, by going to Tesco's or wherever it is somebody mentioned, we actually buy our own poverty as well as buy the poverty of others. And what role the arts and creativity have in contesting that choice of society that we seem to be increasingly under pressure from. And it's one of the reasons why the budgets are going down for the arts as well. So by the younger voices that we've heard today, I've thought about the futures that we have and how that brings it back to us now.
I think as ever, the formula between freedom and security is probably never more critically in the balance. And I think that a friend of mine who works for the United Nations was recently at a sort of workshop which was looking 20, 30 years in advance, and there was generally a consensus across a room full of experts from all sorts of different disciplines that the future is undoubtedly, states will be more controlling. There will be situations that they are not in a position to easily handle, and these difficult situations, whether it's mass displacement by climate change or whatever, or economic divides opening up like they are now, but increasingly, and that actually that freedom is one of the things that we will, it's happening now. Human rights there's a sort of growing contempt for human rights in British politics, particularly in England, and it's extremely surprising, and it's happening extremely fast. So I think a really important point is about the role of the artist, and Wales, maybe has a slightly different relationship to that debate. I don't know. It would be nice to think it did. I hope it. It feels like it does. That fundamental thing that comes through from Kay Andrews' report about rights to it's not language that you're embarrassed to use now. It's almost embarrassing to use the rights language in England at the moment, and I think that gives Wales another very distinct and very important role. So that's all good. So thank you for that. So. What are those recommendations? What are those things? What are those concrete ideas that we can take away from our session today, can we start formulating some shared ideas about maybe the role of the art, role of the institution? We're talking about institutions. The role of the institutions. What can institutions do differently to move some of these ideas forward, particularly the non-financial ones? Because I know the constraints are terrible, but we're all, we don't only have to do things that involve money. And if you go to cultures where there is considerably less money available, it doesn't stop artists from making work. It doesn't stop ideas from being communicated and shared in very, very interesting, exciting ways. So, Dai.
I'm not sure I agree with that. You said a moment ago, there's a secure place to be, whereas it's not secure actually if you're living in Blaenau Gwent and you're facing probably the worst kinds of numeracy and literacy targets. You're looking at unemployment generation by generation. And so on. I wouldn't sing a sob song. And I don't think it either do I accept, not that you said this, Julia, that this is about Wales whinging as a victim, as I read recently. It is about asking for justice. And justice not just because of what we contributed in the past, but justice, as Llaki and David have said, for the younger people who are coming along. And I think that justice has to be resourced. Now, yeah, it's not entirely financial, but to give you one thought, before Kay Andrews' report, I did a report called Arts in Education for the Welsh Government, and they accepted all 12 of the recommendations. Fast forward. But essentially what this is going to mean is that we're going to put in place, let's call it a creativity learning plan, which is going to operate both in regions and in schools across Wales. It has all sorts of aspects, including the aspects of the artists in it. But the outcome is, and it's evidenced by worldwide research, so that please take for granted for a second, but it's evidenced. And the evidence is that if you have a DNA of creativity in the schools, and not just in terms of the arts, then you actually begin to affect the way children, not just from areas of material and social deprivation, but almost right across the piece. Just one sort of small example. We visited lots of schools. I visited one that was kind of the classic Victorian Gothic school on the hill in Cadoxton, near Barry, which is a very poor area, community's first area and so on. And there's that Gothic prison on the hill. Wonderful headmistress. Incidentally, most of the terrific headmistresses we came across were in primary schools. They were all women, of course. And we went into this school and saw the things that she was doing, and believe me, it was just fantastic. And at the end of this, we're going through this hallway, which is almost like a prison thing in a James Cagney movie, with all these little kids sitting down having their lunch in boxes and plastics. It wasn't that bad, but it looked like that. And as we went with Janice, the head teacher, I could see this little blonde girl looking at our progress. And at the end, she was about 7, I think, she came over and she said, without so much as a by your leave, or Mrs. Haywood or Janice or headmistress, she said, "You said that storyteller who came to our school and we all loved was going to come back, and he's never been back. And you said that artist who did those wonderful murals was going to come and do some more, and she never came back either. And you said," and she said, "Well, so-and-so was ill, and such had a flu," and so on. Sort of a series of excuses, but probably real ones. And the child looked at the headmistress and she said, "You do want me to come to school, don't you?" and I think that issue of attendance, if they attend, they can aspire. If they can aspire, they can achieve. And the coup, I think, in my report, above all else, I shared this with somebody earlier on, was I looked up Eton College's prospectus. Go and look at it. They talk about the arts and the arts and the arts over and over again. And think of where Benedict Cumberbatch and all those other actors are coming from, where once we had our Stanley Bakers and our Richard Burtons, and we had different kinds of, and yes, not all financially resourced, communities that created that sense of the need for it. And somewhere along the line, in some instances, that got taken away. And I'll end on this because it'll perhaps lead into, or John might want to say something. I met Rachel Tresize, who was the young Welsh writer who won the first Dylan Thomas Prize 8 years ago, I think now. And Rachel was brought up in the Rhondda in a pretty, she wouldn't mind my saying this because she says it all the time, in a pretty dysfunctional family. And we got chatting. So there she is, this young Rhondda writer. And she said growing up, she had never, ever heard of, and I just reel them off the top of my head, Lewis Jones' Lewis Jones, Rhys Davis, Gwyn Thomas, Ron Berry, Alan Richards, a whole plethora of Rhondda writers, because they weren't available. They weren't available in print, they weren't available in her school, nobody was teaching them, nobody was talking about them, and yet they were she discovered them, and her writing, in a sense, has linked into a tradition which she didn't have. And then John, with National Theatre Wales, put her play, Tonne Pandemonium, on in the heart of it in Park and Dare. And I think that, and it was packed, John, wasn't it? Night after night after night. That's all I wanted to say, really. That it's a way forward, but there are implications about how a society chooses to express itself, and frankly, to be a civilization. And I think sometimes in Wales we are unwilling to take that fragility issue and say there's nothing wrong about being in a fragile situation, because it is actually historically and socially derived, and now we have the courage to deal with it.